The system was never designed to fail this slowly. Most collapses in human history arrived with the thunder of war or the swift devastation of famine, but what is happening right now, in 2026, is something far more insidious. It is a structural unwinding, quiet enough to be dismissed as personal misfortune, widespread enough to be a civilizational signal. Young people between the ages of 18 and 35 are absorbing the first shockwaves of 7 converging realities, and the tragedy is that most of them are interpreting systemic failures as individual shortcomings. That misreading is dangerous, because a person who believes they are simply unlucky will not prepare. A person who understands they are standing in the early corridor of a long emergency will. The first reality is the collapse of economic entry points. For decades, the assumption was linear. Education leads to employment, employment leads to stability, stability leads to asset accumulation. That ladder has not merely become harder to climb, the rungs are dissolving. Labor economists tracking cohort data across developed and rapidly urbanizing economies have documented something deeply alarming. The credential inflation curve has outpaced wage growth by a factor of 3 to 1 since 2015. A degree that once guaranteed middle-income entry now functions as a baseline filter, not a differentiator. What this means in survival terms is that the energy expenditure required to reach financial stability, the metabolic cost of economic participation, has increased dramatically while the caloric return, so to speak, has flatlined. Young people are not lazy. They are running a race where the finish line is being moved in real time, and the science of human motivation tells us clearly that prolonged goal-blocking without perceived progress produces not renewed effort but learned helplessness, disengagement, and physiological stress responses indistinguishable from those produced by chronic environmental threat. The second reality operates in the body before it registers in the mind. Chronic stress in young adults is no longer a psychological abstraction. It is a measurable biological condition with hard downstream consequences. Cortisol dysregulation, which occurs when the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is subjected to persistent low-grade threat signals, does not simply make a person feel anxious. It restructures immune function, degrades prefrontal cortex decision-making capacity, shortens telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that function as biological aging clocks, and impairs the consolidation of long-term memory. The generation absorbing the compounded pressures of housing unaffordability, debt load, climate anxiety, and employment precarity is not experiencing a mental health crisis in isolation. They are experiencing an accelerated biological aging process triggered by environmental stressors, and the medical literature is beginning to confirm what survival physiologists have understood for years. Prolonged threat exposure without resolution or resource access degrades the organism's long-term operational capacity. This is not metaphor. This is cellular biology responding to a world that has become structurally hostile to young human bodies. The third reality is the housing compression crisis, and it is more dangerous than most economic analysts have communicated. Housing is not merely shelter in the survival calculus, it is the foundational platform upon which every other resilient strategy depends. Without stable, affordable shelter, an individual cannot maintain the sleep architecture necessary for cognitive performance, cannot store emergency resources, cannot build the social proximity networks that historically function as mutual aid systems during disruption. What is occurring across major urban centers and increasingly in secondary cities is a pricing compression driven not primarily by supply shortage alone, but by the financialization of residential real estate, the conversion of a biological necessity into an investment asset class. When shelter becomes a commodity traded for yield rather than a resource distributed for habitation, the survival mathematics change entirely. Young people are not failing to acquire housing because they lack discipline or financial literacy. They are being outbid for a primary survival resource by capital systems operating on entirely different time horizons and risk tolerances. The misunderstanding here, the one that costs people their futures, is believing that working harder within the existing system will eventually resolve this. The evidence suggests otherwise, and the survival implication is stark. Those who do not develop alternative shelter strategies, whether cooperative ownership models, geographic relocation calculus, or multi-generational resource consolidation, will remain perpetually exposed at the most foundational layer of their resilience architecture. These three realities alone would constitute a serious civilizational stress test for any generation. But they are not operating in isolation. They are interacting, amplifying one another through feedback loops that the human nervous system was not evolved to detect at the slow frequency in which they operate. The remaining four realities are where the convergence becomes critical. Part 2. The remaining four realities. The fourth reality is one that no generation in recorded history has faced with this precise combination of awareness and helplessness: environmental instability operating on a human lifetime timescale. Previous generations inherited a climate that was, within the margin of a single human life, broadly predictable. Agricultural calendars, infrastructure design standards, insurance actuarial models, and city planning frameworks were all built on climatic assumptions that are now statistically invalid. What young people in 2026 are beginning to feel, not as abstract future threat but as present economic and logistical pressure, is the compounding cost of that invalidity. Flood insurance is becoming unavailable in coastal zones. Wildfire risk premiums are restructuring property markets in entire regions. The agricultural yield volatility that once affected only commodity traders is now visible in grocery price instability that directly impacts household budget management. The survival principle being violated here is one of the most fundamental in emergency preparedness: the assumption of environmental baseline stability. When that baseline shifts, every system built upon it requires recalibration simultaneously, and the generation inheriting that recalibration task is doing so without the capital reserves, institutional support, or intergenerational knowledge transfer that such a task demands. The fifth reality is the attention fragmentation crisis, and it must be understood not as a cultural complaint but as a neurological emergency with direct survival consequences. The human prefrontal cortex, responsible for long-range planning, threat assessment, delayed gratification, and complex problem-solving, requires sustained attentional engagement to function at full operational capacity. Decades of cognitive science research confirm that deep focus is not a personality trait. It is a trainable neurological state that degrades under conditions of constant interruption and novelty-seeking stimulus. The information environment young people inhabit in 2026 has been engineered, with extraordinary precision and enormous financial investment, to prevent the attentional depth that survival-level decision-making requires. This is not conspiracy framing. It is the documented business model of attention economy platforms, confirmed in regulatory filings, internal research disclosures, and peer-reviewed behavioral studies. The result is a generation with unprecedented access to information and dramatically reduced capacity to process that information into actionable long-range strategy. In survival terms, this is equivalent to having excellent sensory equipment but a degraded command center. The data arrives, but the synthesis fails. The threat is visible, but the response architecture is compromised. The sixth reality is the erosion of practical competency infrastructure. For most of human history, survival knowledge was transmitted through direct apprenticeship, the embodied, hands-on transfer of skills that allowed individuals to maintain, repair, and construct the physical systems their lives depended upon. The industrial and post-industrial economic model systematically replaced this competency distribution with hyperspecialization and consumer dependency. Young people in 2026 inhabit a world of extraordinary technological complexity and simultaneously possess the lowest per capita practical repair and maintenance knowledge of any generation in modern history. This matters enormously when systems begin to stress. An individual who cannot perform basic electrical troubleshooting, structural assessment, water filtration, food preservation, or medical triage is entirely dependent on institutional and commercial infrastructure remaining fully functional. When that infrastructure develops gaps, as it is already doing across supply chains, healthcare access, and skilled trades availability, the competency deficit becomes a direct vulnerability. The survival implication is not that every person must become a generalist expert, but that the threshold of practical self-sufficiency has dropped so far below functional that even modest systemic disruption creates disproportionate individual crisis. The seventh and final reality is perhaps the most psychologically difficult to confront because it operates at the level of meaning and social cohesion. The institutional trust architecture that historically provided young people with a navigable framework, reliable information sources, stable community structures, credible long-range social contracts, has undergone measurable, documented deterioration across every major index that tracks it. This is not cynicism. Longitudinal surveys across dozens of countries confirm steep and accelerating declines in institutional confidence among adults under 35. The danger this creates is not merely political. From a resilience standpoint, social trust is load-bearing infrastructure. It determines whether communities coordinate effectively during disruption, whether information flows reliably during crisis, and whether individuals can access the cooperative resource-sharing networks that have historically been the primary human survival mechanism. A generation that has lost faith in coordinating institutions without developing replacement coordination systems is a generation operating with a critical resilience gap precisely at the moment when resilience is most structurally demanded. The convergence of all seven realities into a single generational experience is not coincidence. It is the measurable output of intersecting long-cycle systems arriving at stress thresholds simultaneously. Understanding this is not the end of the story. It is the only honest beginning of an adequate response.